What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Strange Road Detours. Visiting the Mothman today. I'm here with my best buddy, Bub. What's happening, Bub?
Hey, not much. Just hanging out, about to talk about some interesting happenings in the world.
All right, so me and Bub have known each other for a long time. We met in kindergarten and been thick as thieves ever since. And we've been into ufology, cryptids, strange happenings for a long time together. So this is going to be really fun. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah.
You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Crowdcast at The Strange Road. And Bub, let's get started with you. Let's talk to you. Let's talk about your personal journey with the Mothman.
Oh, okay. So I recently began re-exploring the Mothman after being aware of the phenomenon many years ago through the now widely known movie bearing the same name, The Mothman Prophecies. At the time I first watched the film, it's sad to say, but the internet wasn't the find everything machine. Smartphones were still a few years away from being in the hands of the few, and information was just a little more difficult to get for the average research amateur enthusiast. The film did, however, leave a strong imprint. It stuck with me throughout the years. And then, being a follower of ufology and cryptids and ghost tales in general from when you're a kid through your entire life, you kind of hear those stories. But this one was a little bit further out there. However, in the recent past, there was, for some reason, there's become a resurgence of interest in the Mothman and the author who wrote the story, John Keel. So going from novel beginnings of YouTube and internet searches, I found myself at the end of the road, so to speak. No conventional forms of armchair research could take me further. And suddenly a thought crept in my mind. You live within driving distance of the actual place where this event occurred, and there's a museum to see more pieces of the story. So say no more. Being a creature of spontaneity and the fact that my wife was gone, I decided one Saturday afternoon in March of this year to take a drive to the museum and lay eyes on the area myself. The museum is as much of a museum, I guess, that you could have for something like this. I don't know how much more you can make a museum out of the Mothman story. Maybe you could. There's some merch up front. I picked up a Mothman shirt for myself. And I got John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies and Gray Barker's Men in Black, two very heavily involved authors on the subject. And this is where the rabbit hole opened up for me, quite honestly. The book by John Keel is utterly overwhelming in many ways, from the sheer number of sightings of the Mothman and from other sightings of UFOs, the Men in Black, and other strange occurrences. There's some doppelganger instances and an entity who literally gives its name to a contactee during a bizarre encounter. The story that began to unfold took on its own life in a way. I tore through the paperback account of Keel's. I rewatched the Mothman Prophecies, which really helped, just for factual background as far as his book goes in the movie. And then I've watched everything else I can get my hands on, documentaries. What was your first encounter with the Mothman? Was it the movie? Did you have something when you were a kid?
Yeah, I heard about the Mothman from one of those early paranormal shows. And then I remember going on in the in the late 90s on my parents' dial-up computer and on web crawler.
God, that
Yahoo.
noise if you put up the telephone to your head when it was dialing up. Jeez.
So I did a search, and back then, like you were saying, the internet isn't what it is now.
No.
So what came up was some accounts, some basically firsthand accounts and sightings, reports, and some terrible images and artist renderings of the Mothman. And so it was real surface level, nothing too deep at all. And thought it was an interesting story at the time. Didn't think much about it until the Mothman Prophecies came out in 2002.
Right.
I remember renting that from Blockbuster, and it was okay. I thought it was okay at the time. It didn't blow me away in any way. I thought Hollywood kind of dropped the ball, and it could have been better. And so I got to go back and rewatch that still. You were saying that's actually pretty good in hindsight. So
I thought it was good at the time. In hindsight, what I was just thinking was the only reason I could see it falling short was it didn't actually really show the Mothman ever.
Right.
And I think they were kind of trying to leave it that way so that your only lasting image, or most, if you remember, was the red glowing eyes of it, which was kind of the accounts of most of the people in
that's
the town
the big
at the
thing.
time.
Big thing that stuck out,
Right.
the red glowing eyes.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, after the movie came out, I did work with a woman that grew up in Point Pleasant in around 2005, and she, I don't believe she was alive during this. If she was,
Okay.
she was a kid, but she said everybody in the town believed that the Mothman was real, that the accounts really happened. I mean, there were so many accounts, over 200 in a 13-month period, and so many articles written about it. There was national media attention, and it was kind of a big deal. So she had said that everyone in that town sure believed it. So years went by, never thought about the Mothman.
Right.
Got into a million other strange things, lost
Right.
civilizations, ancient wisdoms, conspiracies, and until recently when you started tapping back into the Mothman and went to the museum, we started talking about how cool it would be to do a podcast
Right.
about the Mothman. So you really kind of introduced me to so many things that I didn't know about with this story. I mean, it is deep.
Yeah.
The rabbit hole goes super deep.
Yes, it does.
And I just had no clue. So, let's get into it.
Absolutely.
Cool. So there are, it's a pretty amazing tale, and to lay kind of the foundation or the groundwork, you got to start somewhere. So we're going to start off with the curse of Chief Cornstalk.
Absolutely.
And Chief Cornstalk was a Native American chief in the late 1700s.
The Shawnee tribe.
Yeah, Shawnee. And he and a bunch of different groups of other tribes banded
Absolutely.
together to basically try to make peace with the Ohio settlers at the time.
Well, they'd been fighting them.
Yes.
And they found out it wasn't working.
Right.
And Cornstalk was like, look, guys, we need to go settle this somehow and call a truce. So
he went to the fort.
Went to the fort to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But from there...
So when he went to the fort, he knew that if they would hold him captive, that the other tribes wouldn't attack the fort in trying to basically extend an olive branch.
Right.
So
right.
They took him and his son captive. And then while they were in prison, another group of soldiers was out in the forest.
Hunting or something like that.
And they ran into some of the indigenous people, and one of the soldiers was killed.
Right.
So when they brought the body back to the fort,
that's when it kind of got a little ugly.
The soldiers were enraged, and they went straight into the cell where Chief Cornstalk and his son were, and murdered them both. So the story goes that with Chief Cornstalk's dying breath, he placed a curse upon Point Pleasant, calling upon the Great Spirit to avenge their deaths. And, this legend has been told for 200 years. And so it kind of sets the stage for some of the many things that you're going to see for the next 200 years.
Right.
And so the idea is that the land is cursed. It's experienced massive amounts of trauma. And the land in some way is sort of holding this negative energy that kind of
imprinted.
Yeah. So it's sort of setting the stage for all this high strangeness that we're going to talk about today. So what is the Mothman?
Apparently it's a gigantic man-like creature, like 6 to 8 feet tall, which, I mean, that puts it in some range of being a man-like creature, but I mean, I don't see a lot of 8-foot dudes walking around at night
with 10 to 15-foot wingspans,
jumping from top of tree to top of tree. I mean, there are 6 to 8 foot tall men. You know what I'm thinking? If there's like a hoax, if you want to say, if there was something to compare this to, I mean, but that's a big person, 6 to 8 foot tall, 10 to 15 wingspan, 10 to 15 feet, with wings that would unfold from its back, a lot like a bat or a moth, which was interesting. The way that name came about, I think, was something relating to, I want to say it was a Batman movie, but they used Mothman instead, or maybe that was a character. But a lot of people said it would rise up slowly off the ground, and when it would take off, just like a helicopter, it didn't have to flap its wings to take off. It didn't make noise when it took off.
There was no sound.
No.
No flapping of the wings. The wings didn't move.
No.
They sort of unfolded, and then it just would come up.
Like Dracula, like just rise up and go.
And there are accounts of it flying at pretty high speeds.
Yeah. It did walk on two hind legs. Had a face like a bird. Big glowing red eyes was the number one thing that you hear in nearly every account. And then the effects of the glowing red eyes too, right? Like you looked into some of that after. What happened to people after seeing this thing?
Yeah, so I've always heard of accounts that people have contact with UFOs, and when they look into the lights, they get burns on their eyes, and then eventually conjunctivitis. So you have a lot of those accounts too with the Mothman, is when you gaze into these red eyes that it somehow is emitting some sort of radiation, and people get burns on their eyes and conjunctivitis, and a lot of different reports of that. And so one of those people was Connie Carpenter, who was this Mary Hyer's niece.
Okay.
And we'll get into Mary later. She's
a reputable source.
Yeah, she's a journalist at the Athens Gazette in Athens, Ohio. And Connie Carpenter actually was one of these people that had gotten conjunctivitis from seeing the Mothman. So that was November 27th of 1966. And we're going to kind of just go down the line here of, the sightings that occurred. Like I said earlier, there was 200 sightings from November 15th, 1966 to December 15th of 1967.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. And in a 3-month period, they had over 100 sightings. So there was a bunch of clusters. There was 8 sightings in one night. There were some newspaper articles written about that. So a lot of this is pretty heavily documented. And then really the first major site was Kenneth Duncan. And you want to talk a little bit about Kenneth's experience?
Yeah, he was actually with a crew of guys, and they were out digging graves, which, wow. No thanks, first off. Second, you imagine being out there and you're digging this grave, and he said the other men did not see the creature before it flew away. But he said a brown creature lifted off beyond the trees, and it was no bird. It was a humanoid. It was gliding through the trees, and it was in sight for about a minute. He said he was just absolutely baffled and did not look like it was any kind of bird, but seemed to be a man with wings. Again, like, you got to kind of, if you're seeing this, do you think, well, that's a bird? Because that's an even more abstract thought. It seems like it's more natural to think it's a man with wings.
Well, he thought it was a huge bird, but then he realized how big it was. Like,
that's what I'm saying. How would you wrap your head around that? Yeah. And so then it goes from there to the next sighting on November 13th with your buddy Merle. You know this one better than I do.
Merle Partridge.
Yeah, Merle Partridge.
Yeah, so
TV incident.
That was November 13th, 1966. Merle Partridge had an incident where he was just kind of hanging out watching TV, and his TV started glitching out, or some, surge, static, and he started hearing this winding noise, almost like a generator winding up, and this sort of high-pitch winding noise, and his dog just started freaking out. So then he went out front and was kind of walking around, got his flashlight out, and grabbed a shotgun or some sort of gun, and so when he shined his flashlight, he caught the red eyes. So he went outside, and he was on his porch, and I think on the garage or one of his buildings, on the side of a barn, there were these lights, red lights that were moving around in circles, and these strange kind of circular spiral patterns.
Kind of a dance.
So, he starts shining his flashlight out into the darkness, and then he catches the red eyes with his flashlight, and the dog just bolts. The dog just takes off. And so some fear kind of washes over him, and he's like, whoa, he realizes that there's something not right here.
Right.
And old boy's jamming on the drums down there.
Yeah. Got some grooves in the background.
All right, we got a nice drum track here tonight in the background.
Tasty little section. Little tracks.
So basically Merle's dog takes off. And
Bandit.
And this is John Keel talks about this in his book, The Mothman Prophecies,
right,
written in 1975 about this account. And I believe Gray Barker was one of the first people that interviewed Merle. And so Gray Barker was this like legend ufologist in the West Virginia area. And a lot of people had known about. He was a pretty serious researcher, very scientific minded, skeptical of people's eyewitness accounts and so forth. So he was a pretty thorough guy, well respected. And so, Merle, his dog takes off. The dog doesn't come back. So he contacts the Sheriff George Johnson, and he tells him he shined the flashlight in the field, and the eyes would light up like bicycle reflectors.
And big. So that's, I mean, you're talking.
So then he saw a UFO-like craft with rotating red lights, I believe, also. And the next day he went out and looked in the direction where he was shining his flashlight, and he saw his dog's footprints going around in circles as if the dog was chasing its tail.
Yeah.
There were no tracks coming out of the circle in any direction from anything. So
but
it's
the
like
dog's just
the
gone.
dog just vanished.
Wow.
So never came back, never got his dog back. And then the most famous sighting is November 15th, 1966.
Yeah. And
they're two young couples that are driving near this TNT area that the locals kind of all refer to.
Yeah.
It's a pretty well-known area. It was a former World War II munitions factory where they were making TNT and storing TNT.
Yeah, the West Virginia Ordnance Works.
Yes, exactly. And it was the size of a small city. It eventually became essentially a toxic waste dump. So
right.
There were a lot of chemicals and just weird shit in the groundwater.
Yeah,
and
a lot of stuff that shouldn't probably be seeping through the the bird sanctuary, the wildlife sanctuary.
So it's kind of like a forbidden land anyway. So
right.
it's the locals all say it's haunted, or there's a lot of stories about this area to begin with. Well, and so they're kind of just driving on the outskirts of this area, and basically what they saw was something that was flying over top of them, or something. No, I'm sorry. It was in the middle of the road. Correct.
I saw it on the side of the road. I think
at
first when they were driving up to it. Like, I don't remember if it was one of the girls in the back or one of the guys in the back, but they were driving along and saw it on the side of the road, like standing or kind of half crouching.
Yeah.
And it like stood up. You could see the eyes. And then as they were driving and they could see it, I think in the rear view was when it kicked up its wings and then started taking off after him. And at that point, I mean, I can't remember if it was Scarberry was driving the car, if it was Mallet. I think it was Scarberry was driving the car.
Yeah.
I mean, just as fast as he could get the automobile to go at the time. He's trying to get up to maybe like 60, 70 miles an hour, which that's pretty good speed. And he said it was right along with him.
Yeah.
And it followed him for a little ways. I don't remember if it dodged off and flew off into a field. But they went straight from there to the police station to make the report.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
they were the ones that talked about it lifting up like a helicopter, not flapping its wings. So that came from this sighting.
Right.
And so, a lot of people thought that the Mothman was living in the North Power Plant on this property. So many sightings come from this TNT area over the 13-month period that everyone just kind of assumed that was the Mothman's kind of hangout pad.
Right.
And
started to get a lot of attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So people would like kind of post out post up there and see if they could get a glimpse of the Mothman. People were coming from out of town to kind of hang out in that area and walk through it. So there were some issues like trying to keep people out of there.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to get a glimpse at the Mothman. So, and then there was a whole bunch of sightings that, I mean, we could get into. It's hard to sit here and account all the different documented sightings. Those are the early ones. And then it sort of all culminates into the Silver Bridge collapsing.
Yeah.
December 15th, 1967.
Yeah.
Now, there were people that reported the Mothman flying over top of the bridge the night that it collapsed.
Yeah, possibly
There's a lot
seeing
of
around it.
stories kind of spinning around that.
Yeah.
And pretty much the bridge was built in 1928, and it's connecting Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, Ohio. And it really just wasn't built for modern cars. The weight capacity was overwhelmed, and there was a red light. There was a malfunction on a stoplight, and so you had all these people out there Christmas shopping. So there's all these cars that normally they're not just they're all moving.
Right.
And this one of the beams came undone. And it just sort of shifted and collapsed. Yeah. 47 people lost their lives. This is like a huge deal. I mean, this was a big national story.
46.
46, sorry.
I'm not going to skewer you too bad on numbers. I would know it if it wasn't
Fact
in front of me
check
too.
me.
Yeah. We'll try. Watch out for myself.
But so after this happened, the Mothman sightings and all the other weird things that we're going to kind of get into. You know, there were Mothman sightings, UFO sightings, strange men in black people hovering around this during this period, and all of that just came to an end after the Silver Bridge collapsed.
Basically stopped.
Yeah. So that was kind of an interesting thing. A lot of people want to tie, the Chief Cornstalk's curse and the UFOs and the Mothman, and then it's sort of like this bad omen. When the Mothman appears, this kind of theory that throughout time he's shown up during different windows as an omen or a prophecy of something bad going to happen.
Right. And Keel talks about that in his book too, about different times that the Mothman has been alluded to being around before a great disaster. I was looking for some stuff on that. I mean, that's where I don't know how far to go with it sometimes.
Yeah.
You know. There does seem to I kind of have a saying though, there's where there's smoke there's fire generally. If you're looking at something, at least collectively, if there's that many people seeing something like this or experiencing something like this.
Right.
And it would seem kind of fantastical to just go out and out of blue say, if I said this right now that I'm seeing the Mothman around here, why would 100 people within 3 months say the same thing just to get on my crazy bandwagon?
Yeah.
Like,
exactly.
That doesn't really work that way.
It's just the volume of sightings.
Right.
That's
the validity to the sightings.
And the people that experienced it.
Right.
Police officers and a lot of people probably didn't come forward.
Right.
Either. And to be ridiculed and called a whack job or whatever it may be. They tried to explain away some of the theories were that it's this crane,
a sandhill crane.
The sandhill crane, which has sort of like a red painted face.
Yeah, around its eyes, but
it's a pretty big bird, but it's not 6 to 8 feet tall.
No, it's only like 3 or maybe 4.
Yeah, so mutated birds because of the TNT area, that there may be some validity of mutations happening.
That I don't doubt.
There's a power plant. There was a plutonium factory, different kind of, not in that area, but, that area is kind of well known for the World War II time of creating explosives and different things like that.
Housing a lot of chemicals and TNT, and I think there was another.
So I don't really know how, owls was another theory.
No.
Mutated birds, leftover dinosaurs. There's always been stories of the Thunderbirds.
That one's interesting.
In Native American culture.
Right.
And, the Thunderbirds stories were told that, they carry children and elderly people away. And, it's this spirit that sort of terrorizes people, and this giant bird. And you have a lot of those legends. And then indigenous North America, you have the Payasu.
Okay.
And the Payasu is a terrifying creature with red eyes and a long tail. Some people are making comparisons to the Thunderbirds, the Payasu, the Mothman. In New Jersey, you have the New Jersey Devil.
Sure.
Some of these, there's other flying cryptids. There's stories of pterodactyl that people have seen in Texas and other places in the world.
Yeah.
So you have there's a lot of different creatures throughout times, and Keel goes into some of the things with cave drawings and so forth, and different cultures that have these beings that look a lot like the Mothman,
right,
and artwork and so forth,
right.
There's the Babylonian Pazazu, which is kind of a little close to the Payasu from the North American culture. And the Babylonians had stories about this, and even had artist renderings. You could look that up. It's pretty weird.
That's so wild.
It's very close phonetically, but also the depictions of it with the red eyes and the wings. So, and then in Japan, there's the Karasu Tengu, which is another similar being in Japanese lore that has similar features. And so you can kind of go back in ancient times and a lot of other cultures that have similar stories of these large, out of place, strange flying creatures.
Right. But let me ask you this. After you've read what you've read on the subject, watched documentaries, etc., granted we're not, authorities on the matter, what's Mothman? What is that?
I can't make an assumption. I really don't know. I mean,
I can't even generate a thought on a theory of what I would think it would look like if I was out and I actually saw it.
When we get into John Keel a little bit, he definitely has some theories, and his theories are pretty interesting. And we'll get into John Keel. Let's put it that way. That's we could do a whole show just on John Keel.
He might be a whole side road one time.
Yeah.
To take it down a detour.
But a really, really interesting story that I had no clue about until you turned me on to this was this character Woodrow Derenberger. And so Woodrow Derenberger,
it's a good story,
had this experience or contact. I don't know what you want to call it.
It was definitely a contact.
Yeah, a contact of some sort with,
for what he says,
this strange fellow that introduces himself as Cold and later Indrid Cold.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of the synopsis of Woodrow Derenberger and Indrid Cold.
Yeah.
Now, this is a few towns away, and it was a few towns away from Point Pleasant, and it was a week before the first Mothman sighting.
Yeah.
So this would have been November 2nd, 1966.
Yep.
And Woodrow Derenberger had an encounter with, basically he thought a car was following him.
Yeah.
He's a salesman. He was on the road all day selling kitchenware and so forth, and he had a long day on the road, and I think it was like 7 p.m., and he sees this vehicle behind him, and it's just coming right up behind him super fast, and he's just, what the heck's going on here? And then it kind of pulls alongside him, and then he eventually pulls over, correct?
He is stopped after a certain point because he's being obstructed by the
craft
UFO.
Kind of takes around him, which at the time, until it stopped, he didn't really realize what it was.
Right.
And then what he describes is an old-fashioned kerosene lamp chimney sort of a shape.
That's interesting.
And it was flaring at both ends. And then it sort of narrowed down into a small neck and then enlarging into a great bulge in the center. So this is coming from John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies.
Right.
And so the door slides open, and this man steps out. And this being begins to walk towards the vehicle.
Yep.
And he's kind of afraid to open the window, and then he starts getting this message,
open the window.
Roll your window down.
Yeah.
And so he's looking at this guy, but his lips aren't moving.
Right.
And he's not talking, but he's
just
hear,
smiling.
Can hear he's just
kind
smiling.
of looking at him.
He's a strange guy.
Yeah.
And the being is communicating with him telepathically. He doesn't really hear an audible voice.
Right.
And then he tells him telepathically, "Do not be afraid."
And he wasn't afraid.
Yeah.
He says in his interview, he goes, he was very polite and friendly.
Mm-hmm. And then he says, "My name is Cold. I sleep, breathe, and bleed as you do." Okay, so they have this telepathic conversation, and Cold ends up telling Woody to report the meeting to the authorities and that he will return.
That's strange.
So he goes home and he talks to his wife, and they decide they're going to call the cops. So they call the police, they make a report, and, apparently the police believed him, and, they were understanding of the situation.
Yeah, he was investigated by quite a list.
Yeah.
That wanted to know his story on that.
So then it got out in the press.
Yeah.
And it became this huge story, and there were media teams coming from New York, and it became a big story.
Wright Patterson sent some people to come out and talk to him.
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the supposed home of Project Blue Book, and the legend of the crash at Roswell.
Yeah.
The wreckage was apparently taken to Hangar 48 in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
18.
Hangar 18.
Hangar 18.
Sorry, what did I say? 48?
You're good.
Dummy.
You're good.
So this guy, Cold, this being, this person, whatever he is.
Entity of some nature.
So real quick, the day before this happens, this contact with this Indrid Cold and Woodrow Derenberger.
Yeah.
The day before this happens, there is November 1st, 1966, a National Guardsman actually is working at the armory in Point Pleasant, and he saw a large brown humanoid figure perched on the limb of a tree, and he only reported it after the initial Mothman reports came out. So
sounds a lot like the guys in the graveyard, though, too.
Yeah. Well, people don't want to come out. They see something weird. They don't want to be ridiculed by their peers.
Well, I'm sure his position, he didn't want to come out and talk about that necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's a National Guardsman.
Right.
And so it's just kind of weird that happened the day before this contact with this Indrid Cold character.
Do you think maybe they're trying to go to that area first to talk to them? And now that they're going to Woody, they're saying you still need to tell people.
I think whoever this Indrid Cold dude was, he wanted it documented. He wanted some validity behind the contact
with him and Woodrow.
The story to get out. Yeah, he wanted the story to get out.
Could
for
be.
Whatever reason. So you have UFO encounters. You have the Mothman. You have this strange guy visiting this guy Woodrow. And then November 4th, 1966, Woody is riding with a coworker.
Okay.
And he describes these thoughts start being projected into his mind.
Just while they're going down the road.
And they're not his thoughts. He immediately realizes that it's Indrid Cold communicating with him again. So he's just driving down the road, and Cold starts explaining that he's from the planet of Lanulos in the galaxy of
Ganymede.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
And that him and his people have a life expectancy of 125 years to 175 years.
Not too shabby.
There's no war, poverty, hunger, misery. All those things don't exist on the planet Lanulos. And after these initial contacts, he's visited many, many times. Woody is by this Indrid Cold character. And And, there's reports him telling, there's an interview on YouTube that's in black and white.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was from 1966, where he
it's
went on some TV program.
Yeah.
And we might be able to throw the link up in the description for that or something.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
But he kind of, and I don't think it was that interview, but he does talk about getting on the craft eventually with this Indrid cold and them flying into space. And it gets really
He had
out
gone
there.
missing for like 6 months at one point.
Right. He went missing, and that's when he claimed that he was on the spaceship and was flying through space with this guy.
Or was visiting his planet or whatever he was doing.
Right. So,
that's kind of, that's not easy to do.
And how I didn't know about this really blew my mind. I was shocked. Because these stories are similar to like the Vril Society, these sort of Scandinavian or what they would be called sort of Nordic looking people that were
with
contacting.
Indrid.
Well, it's similar to the Vril Society contact in the 1930s with the Vril Society in Germany.
Yeah.
Which eventually kind of spun off and became the cultic side of the SS.
Right.
And the story goes that these Nordic-looking beings came down there like tall, blonde hair, beautiful, blue-eyed women, and they were channeling these beings at first, and then eventually they started coming in first contact with them.
Okay.
They started sharing technology about craft, and that's sort of, the Nazis eventually kind of came in and co-opted that and developed their own flying technology. So you have these times where people are being contacted by strange beings that are coming down on their craft. They're giving them information.
Right.
They're kind of nudging them towards things. It just reminds me of different stories throughout time. Barney and Betty Hill.
Right.
And that's an interesting one. If listeners haven't heard of that, definitely Google Barney and Betty Hill.
Yeah. That's a good one.
So there's some similarities there. This is definitely not a story that's there's definitely similar things happening there all over the place. So we can one thing, 2 weeks after Darren Berger's writing with his coworker and he starts getting these thoughts kind of beamed into his mind or whatever you want to say, these salesmen started showing up, and Mineral Wells, which was a town not too far away from Point Pleasant, I believe.
Right.
And they were going into people's houses. Some of them were showing up as like kitchenware salesmen. One guy was selling Bibles. Another guy was saying that he was a Mormon mission. And so they had
a lot of cover stories.
Yeah, they had strange skin tone, very dark tan, and but they really didn't seem too interested in selling their product.
Right.
They were more interested in Woody Derenberger and asking the people of the town if they believed Woody.
Right.
If he really had this contact, because like we said earlier, this guy became famous.
Right.
And so everybody knew about Woody. And
but then there's some people creeping around. Yeah.
So these guys were awkward. These they were unintelligible. Descriptions were could barely hold a conversation.
Right.
They just seemed kind of like dummies.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more of those kind of weird sightings that we'll talk about during that 13-month period. And so there is definitely some strange things with these salesmen kind of popping up and asking people questions about Woody. So we can get into John Keel. Let's get into John Keel. There's a lot here. This guy was into so many things.
Quite a few things.
And from what I understand, he was not really into the UFO world at all, and took a job for a magazine and started doing his own sort of comprehensive research on sightings and interviewing people.
Yeah.
He got hooked. He got really hooked into the paranormal and UFOs and kind of started going down this path. So
yeah. Well, like I said before, he started kind of getting interested in those kind of topics because of another gentleman named Charles Fort. So he calls himself a Fortean. and that's kind of like a following or if you're with a movement, whatever you want to say, into the ufology world. And at that time, they didn't have a name for it, looking for the Loch Ness Monster. But
Right.
so John Keel has this Charles Fort as kind of a role model in that sense, and somehow comes upon this story, the Mothman. And so, being under the assumption maybe it'd be a one-time event, he goes down to talk, and try to figure out what's going on with this.
He interviews Scarberry and Mallet.
Yeah, he wants to talk to the kids that saw this Mothman, thinking, hey, it'll be the, one time, so let's go do a quick hit on it. And
he arrived
write
on
a piece.
December 7th, 1966, and stayed there for a couple days.
Yeah.
He went there a bunch of times.
Yeah.
This was the first time, December 7th. The first sightings occurred in mid-November.
Right.
Darren Berger's sighting was November 2nd. So he's coming into the picture about a month after all the weird strangeness kind of starts happening.
Yeah, it's just really starting to kick up. And so he made, like you said, repeated visits throughout the years from 66 through 67 as this progressed on. Then there were also a lot of sightings going on along with the Mothman of UFOs. And we'll get into that more as well. Keel wrote a book that finally came out and was published in 1975 called The Mothman Prophecies. He died in 2009, and that was another reason I was saying it's kind of difficult to find a lot of videography of him speaking.
Presentations.
Lectures. I wish there was more, because it's those are great. It's fun stories to watch.
Yeah.
He dedicated a book to Mary Hyre, the Athens, Ohio reporter who worked for the Messenger and who passed in 1970. And then this is more in your arena too. He talked about the ancient mound builders and the geometric earthworks they created in the area.
10 pages into the book.
Yeah, he doesn't wait long. That's why I was like, oh my gosh, this is so up your alley. It ties everything.
He's kind of setting the stage for, again, the weirdness of the Ohio River valleys.
Right. It's just not it's not just out of nowhere. There's a lot of backstory to it. And as he said too, the earthworks that they were building required, technical skills beyond nomadic woods Indians.
Yeah. He thought that they were extremely advanced.
Yeah.
He talked about them in high regard, and whoever built them had to really know their shit.
Yeah.
He spoke sites in Ohio Valley that were constructed with the same mathematical precisions found in the pyramids of Egypt.
Right.
So he was really impressed with what he saw in the Ohio River valleys in terms of the ancient cultures there, the stories, the lore.
Yeah.
And so he really kind of dove in deep into the ancient history of the area to get kind of a better perspective of, all the weird things that are kind of surrounding this town. And
well, he was balanced, right? He wanted to look at it at the sense of, it reminds me of another fellow giving some advice of, even if you like something or want to believe in it, you can't go in all the way believing, you kind of have to be impartial and balanced on it. Otherwise, you're just hunting everything down that you want to see or want to reinforce. And I'm not upset to say that something's not real.
He was skeptical.
Yeah,
when he entered the whole world of ufology, he was skeptical.
You have to be.
He looked at it in a more of a scientific.
Yeah.
And he didn't get along with a lot of UFO people.
No.
Because he was really
He was very matter of fact about things.
He was tough on people, too. He would call people out.
Right, which only lends to his story.
His credibility.
Absolutely.
I think so, too.
Absolutely. It's 100%. But he said...
One thing he did note
what's that?
Was a lot of these earthworks and mounds that he was seeing could only be seen from the sky.
That's kind of interesting.
So he talks about that as
makes you think of Nazca Lines.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very similar.
Yeah.
The earthworks here in Ohio and West Virginia, Indiana, and here in the Midwest are pretty geometric in nature. The ones in the Nazca Lines are more pictogram oriented.
Okay.
Although there is some geometry and different shapes that are definitely more geometric in nature.
Yeah.
And so one thing he talked about was through his research, he found these old ordinances of pre-Columbian indigenous people. So he dug up this research where they were kind of looking at where all the tribes were before
this part's
Columbus
interesting.
showed up. And
Right.
what they found across the river in Ohio, tons of civilization, these amazing earthworks and culture and art and sculptures.
Right.
And then the other side of the river in West Virginia, it seemed like they just completely avoided that land.
Didn't touch it.
There was a piece of which on some of these maps it says that they're that it's uninhabited was the word that the people that made these maps called.
And he was surprised.
Yeah, he was surprised.
Good land, good wildlife, good resources,
Yeah,
everything
wooded,
you'd want to settle with.
Farmable.
Right.
And the only spot in that area they avoided was West Virginia. And so he also talked about, this is kind of a subject that I've gone pretty deep into. During this time when he wrote this book, there's a resurgence of this diffusionist theory. So diffusionism was a concept that was sort of developed in the 1920s, and pretty much it was people trying to find the out-of-place artifacts, really weird temples, constructions that didn't fit kind of the mainstream narrative.
To do what?
So different constructions and artifacts that were out of place, they seemed way more advanced. And So basically what the theory was that they came from a single mother civilization that was really advanced. They started seeing similarities across cultures. So the idea is
without communication at the time. Right. So how are you getting the idea?
Because the modern thought right now is like isolationism, that there are all these oceans and lakes and that they just didn't have the technology to cross mass oceans to be able to communicate and trade and share culture and share pyramid building and mound building. And but yet at the same time, the mathematics, the geometry in Egypt and down in the Yucatan and here in Ohio, a lot of these same Pythagorean theorems and mathematical principles are encoded, the geometry encoded into these sites. Right. And so the diffusionists say that, well, this is a knowledge that comes from one mother civilization and then spread or diffused throughout the world. Gotcha. So basically these people were all in contact with each other in ancient times. There were trade routes. There were people sailing all over the oceans. There was, and so the other side of that, like I was saying, is isolationism, which, mainstream scholars kind of talk about these technologies and inventions were actually occurred simultaneously, separate from each other, not in contact, but and they don't. I haven't heard a good explanation behind that.
That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I mean,
these inventions of tools and stone making and geometry were sort of just. Here, this guy over here comes up with it, and then another guy in Egypt just sporadically comes up with it.
I could maybe buy, do tools, whatever. You have different silverware in different countries, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But, why are you going to start making pyramids all over the planet? Yeah. And I mean really precise.
With the same principles. And,
right. That's a little different, but.
So a lot of these people, the diffusionist people back in the 1920s, were proponents of Atlantis and were researchers of Atlantis, which on kind of this other scholars sort of scoffed at that. They were made fun of. So the diffusionist idea kind of went away because, once you say Atlantis, you're just a kook. Right. So a lot of people, but in the 1970s, they really saw a resurgence of this idea come back. So people are a bit more open-minded. It starts to be kind of taken more seriously. Right. And so John Keel he sort of gets into this diffusionist idea. And as he's going down this rabbit hole of studying earthworks and mounds here in the Ohio River Valley in West Virginia. So it was kind of cool to see how deeply immersed he was in
researching.
Yeah.
And his own views. Mm-hmm. And well, he had a lot of strange things happen to him too. Yeah. So he kind of, maybe that gave him a better perspective on I don't know. When you talk, I've never talked to somebody that's seen the Mothman firsthand, but I mean, try to imagine in that time going in and talking to people. Like, it's not like, oh, I saw a grizzly bear.
Yeah.
This is
Little,
how do you
different.
take that as a person that goes, I mean, I would love to find out. That would be very interesting. But at the same time, how do you stay balanced in what you're reporting on and how you're analyzing what you're hearing? And I mean, I think the Charles Fort background and his kind of, interest that became an obsession helped him objectively report this better than maybe most could.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, at the same time that he was taking in the information, he's also very, very diligent about how he processes it. And he says in his book as well, for every account that I give you, there's 50 more that I had to get rid of because I debunked them based off of this.
He had his own process.
And he had a system, and that's what brings that book to an even better level of, like I said, of viewership almost. It almost feels like you're there at certain points. Again, not that it's very linear at certain times, but it gives you a very good perspective of how the people were surrounding that time period and the different sightings that were going on.
Yeah.
But he also, he talks about, the kind of the traditional aspects too of what most people talk about when you get into ufology of there's cave paintings about UFOs, there's accounts throughout history and ancient texts across multiple different disciplines and belief structures, and
John Keel did believe that ETs were visiting this planet for a long time, and he kind of went at the guy that wrote Chariots of the Gods.
Von Daniken?
Yeah, he kind of went into Von Daniken a little bit and actually talked about a couple other guys that were, much more researched and developed in their theories that were saying similar things to what Von Daniken was saying, but he was more of kind of just on the surface level and not, researching, and the proof just wasn't there in John Keel's opinion.
He had his own brand.
Yeah.
John Keel's, which is why it is interesting. It is refreshing. Maybe it does squash out a lot of different stories that maybe, quite frankly, and that's where you kind of say, do I want to be the own judge of what information I'm getting in that sense? And you kind of have to know what you're willing to outsource to who you think has a better ability to determine whether it's credible or not.
Right.
And if I'm looking through the lens of John Keel, I'm not mad about that.
Right.
I don't think he's discounting things that aren't plausible. But again, some people, and I'm not even mad about Von Daniken's take on it.
I love Eric Von Daniken. That guy single-handedly sparked the ancient alien wave in all across the world. So,
has gotten people looking at things differently.
That's great.
Yeah, it's just to get your mind open to thoughts. It's not saying that I back anything on there 100%.
Yeah, here's the information.
Yeah.
Take it in any way you want. Make your own mind up.
Yeah, and that's what Keel's doing as well, is, still have the gumption to go down and report on this. It wasn't a light duty of reporting on it that he was down there for.
And one thing that we were just talking about earlier, and sort of, what is the Mothman? How did it get there? And this is a quote from John Keel. From time to time, the playful inhabitants of the other world climb through the curtain in the areas we call windows, and they stalk us to drink our blood and create all kinds of mischievous beliefs and misconceptions in our feeble little terrestrial minds. So he talks about these sort of windows in time and areas where things can kind of come through.
Right.
These window areas or zones of fear.
And
maybe it opens up through these lands that have been traumatized and
maybe, but I almost think of it like a time of like, I don't, if it was that window of space,
yeah,
why would it stop? if that's its working window area. I think it's more of like your window of time. Let's put it this way. I did a hike in a canyon where it's very steep. You go down it. The bottom of that canyon every day gets like 30 minutes of sunlight because as the sun passes over, it can hit it. That's more the window I'm thinking of. Like this Mothman could come in at this perfect angle of time or space when it could interact. And maybe
from other dimensions.
Right. Well, he calls them
like an interdimensional thing.
What does he call them? He has some other name for it. I can't think of it at the moment. Super something. Super spectrum. That's what it is. He calls it the super spectrum. But he basically says that these things are always here.
Right.
So, just like there's radio waves going around you right now and all these things happening that we can't see, but they're happening.
Yeah.
And
whether there's instruments that can pick up those radio waves.
Right.
We can hear a song.
Right.
Wi-Fi signal.
Right. Well, maybe there's all these different dimensions. There's television signals going around us right now. There's a lot happening in space and time that is always around us that we don't interact with.
Right.
But so what if there are those things on that spectrum, his super spectrum or whatever he calls it, that when they get that chance that we either line up perfectly or there's some ability for them to interact with us. That window
opens up and then something like Mothman can come through.
You can see it. Maybe there's a physical touch to it. Like you can definitely, I guess, have an interaction with its eyes.
Right.
And get this, wonderful burn and conjunctivitis from seeing the glow of the Mothman's eyes. But yeah, he had this thought that they were this, I thought he said ultra terrestrials.
Yeah.
That they're always here. They've been here for the eternity of humankind and before us, and that we do see them, but they're not always in our plane of existence, or they're not always able to interact with us.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting take on it. So it's not that they're coming from another planet or from maybe outer space, or maybe even say with the Woodrow Derenberger and Indrid Cold. Is that an alien? Is that somebody on this plane of existence already that can interact with us from time to time?
He said he had a planet. He was like a physical being from a planet.
He said he came from Lanulus.
Right.
Okay.
He had children. He had a wife called Kimmy. Kimi. No joke. So that's a strange one.
That's weird. That's funny.
Keel also talks about, we hit it a little bit before, but he's talking to this journalist, Mort Young. And Mort Young had records of UFO reports that were kept at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And according to Mort Young, he was got his hands on some of these documents and basically had come to the understanding that the depository for all the records from Project Blue Book were held at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Yeah.
And Mort Young was able to view a lot of these records. Now, some of them were heavily blacked out and redacted.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a whole lot of info that he could derive other than he knew for a fact that the records were kept at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
And Project Blue Book's a whole nother episode, which really fascinating stuff there, which evolved into so many other UFO programs with, U.S. naval intelligence, and everybody kind of had their own compartmentalized UFO project throughout the years.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting. Keel ties a lot of the weird things we have here in Ohio, which, so from, the earthworks to, I know he was in Athens, talking to people about paranormal ghosts, and Athens, Ohio being one of the most haunted places in the country.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
A lot of weird stories, a lot of weird legends. So that was kind of cool. Keel tying many different things here, a lot of different stories here in Ohio.
Right.
And so UFO activity during this time was just off the chain.
Yeah, as much as people were seeing the Mothman, they were seeing UFOs. UFOs
and Mothman together in certain ways, where they would see lights in the sky and then boom, Mothman would be there.
Yeah.
So you had some things that were kind of doubling up. And
and Keel had a lot of his own interactions with the UFOs, like apparently like riverboats and like up and down the waterways,
Yeah.
you know, transporting goods, what have you. At night, they would see lights in the sky, and they would shine their lights up at them, and these things would dodge out of the way of the lights.
Right.
And so Keel actually had an encounter where he was doing the same thing. He was taking I think a flashlight and shining at it, and he said it would jump out of the way.
Yeah.
And then he would actually
Like
talk to them in Morse code.
Yeah, yeah.
But then he went even a crazier step further. He said he was making up his own language. So in his mind, he could have been doing whatever he meant for one is yes, two is no, etc.
Mm-hmm.
It could have made no sense to no one else, but somehow these things understood him again, and
Right.
they were able to like communicate messages to them on how to, whatever that means. Does that mean I'm going to get you to move around?
Yeah.
Does you jump in a certain pattern? That's where I don't really know what he means by that, but I mean, I assume it's something to that effect.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were a lot of UFO reports going on the same time as the Mothman, which then generates another step in the Mothman web, which I called, what did I call that? Cotton candy hot dog nacho sandwich, something like that. I mean, it's just this giant pile of cotton candy nacho cheese dog. That's what it was. It's just everything.
It's like everything you ever would want in a story. It's got it all.
Because the topping on this becomes now with the Mothman and UFOs, there's some Men in Black sightings.
Yeah, the Men in Black kind of come in.
I thought that movie when that came out,
yeah,
with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, I thought that was all just. I never knew any validity to the Men in Black stories in general either. So maybe that's what kind of helped
stories when I was a kid
it.
about the Men in Black, and
I didn't really hear good ones, or I didn't. It didn't stick in my mind as much. It made more sense though. Watching the Men in Black, the movie, seeing the Mothman prophecies, and then reading about it, you know, before and after.
Right.
Putting that whole picture together of how. Wait a minute. Maybe the, Hollywood films of these aren't based. They're not terribly based. If you watch the Men in Black movie, it uses a lot of the same elements in Gray Barker and Keel.
Some of these reports from Point Pleasant specifically.
It seems almost interwoven into that film.
Yep. And so Keel kind of lays the foundation when he goes into the Men in Black. He talks about other cities and other like bartenders and waitresses in New York, and there's somebody in like Texas or Wisconsin, and they would come into a restaurant, and again, a lot of these guys looked what this woman said as Oriental, or extremely tan.
I don't remember if they had a nationality.
Awkward, unintelligible. But this one specific story, this guy comes in, he's dressed in a black suit, very out of place, just looks strange, and couldn't communicate very well, was kind of just gruff and grumpy, and he orders a steak and Jello off the menu, and couldn't figure out how to use the utensils with the steak.
Right, the waitress was showing him how to cut it up.
The waitress had to show him how to eat Jello. He was trying to suck it up with a straw.
Yeah.
And so she got a spoon out and was like, "This is how you eat Jello." And so it's just a lot of those kind of reports of they're just out of place, awkward. They just don't come off as in any way. They just don't connect with people,
which makes it all the stranger.
Mm-hmm. And
even stranger.
And the reports are like old model Cadillac.
Right.
These kind of big older cars.
Brand new though.
But brand new.
20 years old.
Shiny as can be, like they just rolled off the lot. And that's Men in Black with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. They ride around in an old Lincoln.
Right.
And it's all tricked out, but it looks old.
Right.
Older model, no big deal.
Right.
So they
start showing up.
One of the interesting, and this is kind of a nice segue into Mary Hire. So they're kind of asking townspeople about John Keel. The Men in Black kind of show up and they're asking questions around town.
To a lot of witnesses of
UFO
either
sightings
Mothman or
or-
UFOs, they would just show up. They could be entwined with the Mothman sighting just by asking the witness, well, were you talking to John Keel?
Right.
There seemed to be a weird strangeness about John Keel himself.
Yeah, they were really interested
that was
in John
tied
Keel.
in with all of this. That's where that layering.
And he would bring up Gray Barker.
Yeah, he got brought up as well.
They'd be, coming up to one of the townspeople. They'd knock on their door. They'd ask him, I'm friends with Gray Barker. I'm friends with John Keel.
Yeah.
I'm friends with Mary Hire.
Yeah.
So they would drop these names in hopes to get
a little bit of friendliness going.
Yeah, exactly. Breaking the ice a little bit.
Right. See what's going on.
So one Mary Hire, Athens, Ohio journalist, she was kind of just a reporter that was doing stories about UFO sightings, Mothman.
That all started because of the Mothman.
Okay.
Before that, she was known as the Stringer.
Okay.
And that was, births, deaths, marriages, etc.
She was like a columnist.
Basically.
Yeah.
Right? And so she's doing that for the newspaper. And knowing all that, she's the perfect conduit knowing all of the people.
Right.
So
she knew everybody.
So when people started having, sightings or they had interactions,
they would go to her.
Right. She was the first person they could go to. They felt comfortable with her. And again, she just knew everyone.
Yeah.
And this is a small community. So Keel found out pretty quickly because he wasn't really sure how he felt about her when he first met her. I think he puts in his book that, he thought she was a busybody and a so-and-so. And he quickly found out that she was a very highly regarded lady in that neighborhood and community. Yeah.
He dedicated his book to Mary Hire.
Right.
So
she, in a lot of ways, piped Keel in.
She died in 1970.
She died
very shortly
She died
after.
not long after the bridge went down itself.
Mm-hmm.
Do you imagine that? Living through all this and then you get done with it and it's just like...
Yep.
I guess that was the finality was watching the Mothman series. That's interesting. But yeah, she had her own experience with the Men in Black a number of times. And there was one that I think we were watching the other night or hearing a recount of it that was interesting was the little man showing up in her office.
Yeah.
I don't know if she was at the state courthouse at the time working or where she
was. There
was.
was 2 men that showed up originally. And, I'm sorry, this guy with a dark complexion, Oriental looking.
Yeah, the little square haircut.
Mm-hmm.
Big, thick glasses on.
Right. And he's just an awkward guy. Kind of stumbled around. And he says to her, heard you have a lot of UFO sightings here. And, and mind you, this is after the Silver Bridge collapses.
Right.
So this is kind of, things are winding down. And this character comes in and, everybody's asking questions about the Silver Bridge. Nobody cares about UFOs or Mothman at this point. Right. The whole town was concerned about their loved. I mean, there's only like just over 2,000 people in Point Pleasant.
Right.
46 people died. Everybody knew somebody that passed away in that tragedy.
Yeah.
So the fact that this guy comes in, so here you got a lot of UFO stories. And she says, yeah, we have some stories here. And we have quite a few sightings here. And she was kind of just taken back. And so this Men in Black character says, what would you do if someone told you to stop writing about UFOs?
Right.
Mary Hire says, I tell them to go to hell. So, she's kind of this badass lady that just kind of tells this guy, hey, screw off. I'm going to report what I want to report about.
Right.
And he starts asking her questions about John Keel. And says, John Keel's a liar. He didn't see any UFOs. And she says, that's absolutely not true. I was with him, and I had my own experience, and I can confirm that John Keel has seen things in this area. And he is asking if she knew Gray. Maybe this is different. I'm getting them mixed up. But he just kind of drops these names. And so later that afternoon,
said he knew both of them.
Yeah, exactly. So later that afternoon, a different guy. This guy's got like real dark black eyes. He's even has darker tan skin. He looks Korean or Oriental according to Mary, but he's got these really weird kind of long tapering fingers that are kind of gangly.
Okay.
And it just, again, out of place. Introduces himself as Jack Brown. Says he's a UFO researcher, but he's got like this stammer.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for this guy to get his words out. And he says again, what would you do if someone told you to stop reporting about UFOs?
Says this to Mary Hire.
The same thing again to Mary Hire. And she says, are you with those guys from earlier? So I guess it was 2 guys. I have in my notes here. It was 2 guys, and then this guy came by himself, this Jack Brown. And she says, are you with the guys from earlier? And the MIB guy stammers. He says, I'm a friend of Gray Barker. And he's that well-known UFO researcher we were talking about earlier. And then Mary says, do you know John Keel? And the guy says, I used to think the world of John Keel, and now I think he's a liar. And
he said he was a liar because he said he'd seen UFOs.
Right. He's a liar because he said he's seen UFOs.
That's kind of strange.
And so this is when Mary says, I know he's seen things, and because I was with him when he saw them.
That's crazy.
So the Silver Bridge is collapsed, and Mary Hire's sort of on the front lines of the bridge. The national media is contacting her. The local people are contacting her. So she's kind of the go-to lady around during this whole time.
Right.
Super fascinating woman. And seemed to have the respect of everyone in the area. And so, there's all these different players, these different events. You got the UFOs, the Mothman, the Indrid cold.
Right.
And, the curse of Chief Cornstalk.
How much can you put into what,
Yeah, it's just got everything.
That's why the Mothman, in general, when we talk about it and we talk about Mothman, I guess I'm framing it in the sense of the movie, the Mothman Prophecies, or the book, just off of the name. But when you actually talk about it, like you're saying, there are so many different levels to this. I mean, you could come at it from saying, "Oh, hey, do you know that ghost story? Oh, hey, do you know that cryptid story? Oh, hey,
sightings of Mothman now.
I know,
all over the world. Fukushima, in Japan, a bridge that collapsed in Mississippi. There were reports of a Mothman type creature being, seen over the Fukushima power plant before the tsunami happened.
Right.
You have, I just saw there's a photo that some guy in Point Pleasant in 2016 took a photo of, a Mothman type dude. Who knows if that was real, but it's still in the collective consciousness. These beings are still being reported.
Right.
It really hasn't stopped in Point Pleasant. It stopped for a while, but there are reports now of Mothman sightings in that area even now.
I mean, do you remember that time we got lost coming back from Illinois and we ended up in Daniel Boone National Forest?
Yeah, I fell asleep.
If
for
there was
20
ever going to
minutes,
be,
and then we ended up in Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. We weren't supposed to be going to Kentucky.
Missed one road.
Cincinnati.
I missed one road. It must have been a big road. But what I'm going to say is, now imagine that, of all places, was one of the places where I thought we were going to see something.
Oh, I thought we were going to get abducted.
Who knows? There could have been something out there. I swear there was a random graveyard up in those hollers.
If Bigfoot would have just came out from behind a tree and waved at us,
wouldn't have been surprised.
Not at all.
Wouldn't have batted an eye.
That was a deep, deep back road. Weird. And I don't know how we got out of that.
I don't think it was a real road.
It was just.
I don't know what it was, but it doesn't seem like it was real in hindsight.
Dirt road.
It was really bizarre.
And then we came up through Marietta.
Yeah.
It was like, oh God, thank God, civilization.
That might have been where near Woody was, but imagine in that night, and as we're going around, you see a 6 to 8 foot tall, guy-looking bird thing, Mothman, with red eyes, 10 to 15 foot wingspan, I can't. I mean, it's just too much there. Now, this is the crazy part. That's not the only thing about the Mothman.
No.
It's like the Mothman's a traveling carnival of weird shit.
Yeah.
You know? Mothman, UFOs, Men in Black. But there was also a lot of strange stuff that happened with the Mothman as well, with, telephone lines having weird static electricity.
Lines,
yeah, there's a lot of weird things with power in general
Sound.
around it. Yeah.
Really weird noises.
Well, and there were things with Keel where people were impersonating him.
Yeah.
On the
phone. About that.
He would talk to Mary, and he would say something. She'd be like, "Oh, well, you were just saying 5 minutes ago on the phone this," and he's like, "I didn't call you."
Weird.
Like a lot of weird stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know how much further in that book you have, but like I said, there's so much to it. That's where there's not enough time to even really go that deep with it.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of strangeness surrounding even that. So it's kind of, his window theory. Was he looking at that area at the right time? Was that just his kind of curiosity as well? Because he wasn't really...
He was being pulled into...
reporting on things like this super in-depth before, and you just kind of as he said, I think, you hit a home run.
He was doing research for a magazine, I believe.
Right.
And then, I don't know if it was the same story that brought him to Point Pleasant or not.
I thought that...
It might have been.
I'd have to look up and get the facts on that.
Because he had seemed pretty... Not a total expert, but he had come across some weird things up to that point. I don't think this was this is probably the most in-depth, strangest thing he's come across at that point.
Well, and again,
first-hand experience.
It just keeps going.
Yeah,
it's not just
never ends.
It's not just one UFO incident.
I really thought that a couple crazy people saw this thing, the bridge collapsed. Game over. That was it. That was the sighting.
No.
I didn't get much from the movie, as far as like the Indrid Cold and the Men in Black. I just don't. I don't remember. Is it? I need to rewatch it.
Indrid Cold is definitely in the movie.
Okay.
Because he interacts with, and again, I can't think of the actor's name.
It's Richard Gere is the lead.
He's the lead, but the guy that plays one of the locals that Richard Gere interacts with, the guy that holds him up at gunpoint in the shower scene. That's the guy that has these interactions with Indrid Cold. And in that role in the film, Indrid Cold is kind of like a prophet to that guy. He tells him all these different things that are going to happen, but he doesn't necessarily tell him there's going to be a car crash on such and such street. He tells him in kind of like coded messages when he talks to him that, this is going to happen in Denver 999 or whatever it was. It was some airplane that goes down, and in that sentence of what it tells him how many passengers on the plane perish in the wreck. And so that's how they kind of wove it into that. But
ooh, you know what? That reminds me. Mary Hyre had a dream.
Yeah.
The night before or the week of the Silver Bridge collapsing, where she was dreaming about the townspeople drowning, and she just had this horrible feeling that something bad was going to happen after this dream kind of came up. Turns out a bunch of other people in the town had similar dreams and nightmares.
A lot of people,
about
it looks like,
a tragedy that was potentially going to pop up in the town. So, it just never ends. I mean,
maybe that's another level of that high strangeness.
Yeah.
There's like a community effect at this level to where there's so many
collective
people.
Consciousness is being affected on a large scale. So it's like everybody's interconnected into this weirdness.
Well, if you want to take it a step further, if you have all those chemicals in the ground and soaking into the earth.
Right.
If there's
Maybe they're just losing their shit.
Well, what if it's the earth itself? If that's like a protective thing of like, hey, you've messed up my natural integrity so much with these chemicals that I'm going to unleash the Mothman on you. You summon the Mothman by putting so much duck butter in the water.
Well, man, I honestly, we could continue this conversation for probably another 3-4 hours.
Right.
But, I mean, I think we got into some the meat and potatoes of this story.
Right.
Super fun.
Absolutely.
I had a great time researching this with you and
Same.
Stone. And this has been a blast. This is Strange Road Detours, episode 1. And that's a wrap.
All right.
Thanks, buddy.
Absolutely. Same.
All right, bro.